Hey, what's going on, everybody? So today we're going to go ahead and finish up our cutting board with the epoxy inlay in it. We're going to pop it out of the mold, run it through the planer, sand it down, and finish it up with some cutting board oil. So stick around if you want to see how it's done. So this first part's obviously easy. We're just going to go ahead and screw it, and then I'll go ahead and stop and show you how I pop it out of the mold. Alright, so now that I got the screws out, you can pretty much just pop this thing apart basically with a rubber mallet and just knock the sides off. They come off really easy. Like I said, that Tyvek tape is awesome. It works really well. Alright, and then the last part of it to separate the cutting board from the base, alright, because obviously there's a lot of epoxy that's contact at the bottom of it. So I just use an old chisel. You can use a putty knife, and you're just going to kind of work it in there. If it's a bigger piece, you might need to use two of them. But see how easy that came apart? Super easy. Like I said, this Tyvek tape is money. So a couple things to note. All right, if you look at the back of this, you'll see some spillover a little bit with the epoxy, but this is super minimal. Like I said, why it was so important before to brace down your wood pieces so that way you don't have a lot of leakage underneath. This is extremely minimal, and this will come off really easy in a planer. If I would have locked it down, there would have been a ton of wasted epoxy underneath. So it saves your work, and it also saves you money in the long run. So now we're gonna go ahead and get ready to run it through the planer. All right, so now we're gonna go ahead and run this through the planer. I mean, obviously if you have a planer, you know the deal. But if you're looking at getting a planer or wanting to get into this, the biggest thing is just remember how wide your base is gonna directly correlate to how big of a piece you can run through there. Mine's a 13-inch wide planer, so I can max out my cutting boards at 13 inches to get them through the planer. So there's no issues. Or if it's a little bit over, you're just gonna have to run them through your table saw just to shrink it down a little bit to fit whatever planer that you're gonna be running. So now all I'm going to do is just run them through the table saw to get a clean edge on either side. And you may have a little bit of epoxy that comes over. If you have a track saw or something like that, it may be easier to do it, but I just try to chip as much off as possible. You just get a straight enough edge. Or if you have a joiner, you can run it through the joiner to help with that as well. But there's not a whole lot. It's pretty much flat on this side, so I'm going to run it through each side to clean up this little bit of epoxy that's left over. So now that I got my edges cleaned up, I'm going to go ahead and clean up the outside edges, the short edges. I'm going to get my big table saw sled out, and then we'll go ahead and knock that out. So you could definitely do this on a sliding miter saw or just a regular miter saw. Just may have to flip it over depending on how wide your piece is. But I needed a new table saw sled. Just waiting on a piece of T-track to come in so I can go ahead and use that stop block from Cat's Moses that I made on the other smaller sled. But I intentionally made this one this big so that way I could run these 13-inch wide cutting boards through here and it not tip, not be an issue. There's zero movement. It's actually kind of tight. But I haven't used it before for actually any projects, so this will be the first run at it. Let's see how it works. Well, I'd say it worked pretty well. Probably need to get a new blade, some burn marks, but those will be able to sand off. But now I've got a nice squared up cutting board. All right, now we're gonna go ahead and sand it. I'm just gonna use an orbital sander, work from 80 up to 320. since there is a lot of scratches that need to come out, which isn't too hard to get out of the epoxy. But if there's still some swirl marks in the epoxy, I'll actually just wet sand the epoxy with 600 or 800, going up as high as 1,000 or 1,200 if need be, to get all the swirls and stuff out, especially with this being a clear epoxy over top of it, so that way you can really see down through it. If it's a colored epoxy, it's not as critical, but you want this top part to look like glass so you can see through at the brass casings inside of it. Alright, so now the next thing that I'm going to do is spray water on it to get the grain to pop. It's called popping the grain, pretty self-explanatory. But what that does is it causes the grain to rise, so that way when you go back and sand it over, it should keep it an even smoother, flatter finish after some use of it once it's completely finished. Typically I'll go up to 120 or 180 and then I'll spray it and then hit it again with that grit sandpaper once it's completely dry. But because I'm a knucklehead and I didn't get any 120, I've got 80, 220, and 320. I'm going to spray it, hit it with 80 again, and then continue on with 220 and 320, which will be fine. It'll get it to where I want to, and then I'll get into wet sanding the actual epoxy. The cool thing is once you pop the grain, you can start seeing what your finished product's going to look like, but it'll be way better once it's really shiny epoxy and you've got your final finish on your wood. Okay, now I've got all the way sanded up through 320, and there's still some spiraling I want to get out of the epoxy to clean it up a little bit before I go ahead and seal it. But all I'm going to do is just, instead of spraying the whole board, because I'm just focusing on the epoxy, I'm just going to spray down my 600 grit sandpaper and just lightly sand it. So now that I got it up through 1,000 grit, which I'm happy with, got all the swirls and everything out of it. Since there's a little bit more water on the sides, I gotta let this dry again, and then I'm gonna go back and hit it with 320 again, paying attention not to hit the epoxy at all. And then once that's done and sanded up, then we'll go ahead and finish it. All right, now that we've got it all sanded down and ready to go, I'm gonna go ahead and finish it. And this is what I use: a walrus oil, cutting board oil. This stuff is awesome. I use it for all my cutting boards. Absolutely love it. This is the absolute best part of any epoxy build, once you actually get to see your work come to life. Check that out. I'm gonna go ahead and keep working on it and get it all finished up, and then we'll show you the final. I'll just go ahead and let it sit and absorb as much as possible, and then I'll go back and put another 2 or 3 coats on, but let's get a little close up. The other thing that's really cool is when you look at this from the side. Let's see if we can get a good picture.